We have Dr. Nandita Tauro from San Hospital over here, myself, Dr. Anila, Dr. Prerna from KEM, and Dr. Devangi from San Hospital. We are taking a case discussion presented by Dr. Nandita. Nandita, start presenting your history.
A 54-year-old male patient named Sunil Hegde, resident of Chembur, Hindu by religion, laborer by occupation, came with chief complaints of yellowish discoloration of the eyes since 20 days, abdominal distension since 20 days, complaints of fatigue since 10 days, and complaints of passage of black tarry stools since 3 days. Patient was apparently all right 20 days ago when he developed yellowish discoloration of the eyes. It was insidious in onset and gradually increasing in nature and was noted by his relatives. Patient complains of abdominal distension since 20 days. It was gradual in onset and progressively increased to the present size. Abdominal distension was associated with swelling of bilateral lower legs since a period of 5 days. It was present throughout the day with no aggravating or relieving factors. He complains of fatigue since 10 days, which was experienced in the form of slight limitation of physical activity. Patient had no symptoms at rest. He is able to perform light effort requiring activities, but has difficulty in performing moderate or vigorous effort requiring activities. Patient also has complaints of passage of black tarry stools since 3 days, 1 to 2 episodes per day. No difficulty in passage of stools. Stools are semi-solid in consistency and non-foul smelling. No history of high-colored urine, generalized itching, clay-colored stools in the past, or fever to rule out obstructive jaundice. No history of abdominal pain, fever, vomiting, thus ruling out intestinal obstruction. No history of difficulty or effort required while passing stools, thus ruling out constipation. No history of rapid weight gain, thus ruling out fatty abdominal distension. No history of lower limb swelling out of proportion to abdominal distension, abdominal pain, bluish discoloration of lips, palpitations, chest pain, breathlessness at rest or lying down, nighttime awakening due to sudden breathlessness, persistent cough, wheezing, or pink-colored sputum to rule out right heart failure. No history of puffiness around the eyes or decreased urine output to rule out renal failure. No history of postural variation of lower leg edema to rule out chronic venous insufficiency. No history of passage of blood in vomitus to rule out gastric or gastroesophageal varices. No history of passage of frank blood in stool to rule out internal hemorrhoids, bleeding mass per rectum or colitis. No history of increased frequency of passage of stools to rule out diarrhea. No history of ecchymosis, petechiae, easy bruising to rule out coagulopathies. No history of pain during passage of stools to rule out bleeding fistulae. No history of jaundice in the family to rule out hereditary disorders of jaundice. No history of jaundice since childhood to rule out congenital or autoimmune causes. No history of blood transfusions, unprotected sexual contact, travel history, fever to rule out hepatitis. No history of medication intake to rule out drug-induced liver disease. No history of significant weight loss to rule out neoplastic causes. No history of nausea, vomiting, decreased appetite, fever, abdominal pain to rule out infective causes. No history of sleep disturbances, mood swings, daytime sleepiness, convulsions to rule out hepatic encephalopathy. No history of swelling, puffiness around the eyes, decreased urine output, dialysis history to rule out hepatorenal syndrome. No history of breathlessness in upright posture, generalized weakness to rule out hepatopulmonary syndrome or portopulmonary hypertension. No history of palpitations, chest pain, syncope to rule out cirrhotic cardiomyopathy. Past history. He had history of jaundice with abdominal distension in 2017. Ascitic fluid tapping was done and patient was conservatively managed for the same and started on multivitamins and tablet Amiflu, which is a combination tablet of amiloride 5 mg and furosemide 40 mg once a day. He stopped medication in mid-2020. No history of fever, blood transfusion, or ICU admissions during that time. No history of hypertension, tuberculosis, diabetes mellitus, ischemic heart disease, stroke, asthma, or epilepsy. No history of surgeries in the past. Family history, no history of similar complaints in the family. Personal history, height 170 centimeters, weight 68 kgs, BMI is 23.5 kg per meter square. Diet is mixed. No history of loss of appetite. Melena is present with the passage of black tarry stools. Bladder is regular, no urinary discoloration. Sleep is normal, no history of significant weight loss. Substance abuse. Prior to 2017, patient consumed 90 ml of whiskey per day into 17 years, which makes an alcohol consumption of 64.8 grams per day for a period of 17 years. His cage criteria is 3/4. He has no history of tobacco chewing, no history of smoking. Effort tolerance of the patient is up to 2 flights of stairs. Medication history. Patient is currently on a combination medication of amiloride 5 mg with torsemide 10 mg, tablet calcium 500 mg BD, tablet multivitamin BD, injection octreotide 50 micrograms per hour for 5 days, tablet pantoprazole 40 mg per day. No history of drug allergy or drug reactions. Diagnosis: a 54-year-old male patient who is a chronic alcoholic with history of jaundice, abdominal distension, fatigue, and passage of black tarry stools, probably due to alcoholic liver disease, with hepatocellular failure in the form of ascites and melena, posted for upper GI endoscopy. General physical examination. Patient is conscious oriented. General condition is fair. He has a height of 170 centimeters, weight of 68 kgs, BMI of 23.5 kg per meter square. Mild pallor is present. Moderate icterus is there. Pleural edema is pitting. No cyanosis, clubbing, or lymphadenopathy. Pulse rate of 96 beats per minute, measured at the right radial artery, regular rhythm and good volume. Blood pressure of 130 by 70 millimeters of mercury in the right arm supine position, and a respiratory rate of 18 cycles per minute. Airway examination, mouth opening more than 3 fingers, MPC class 2, no loose teeth or missing teeth. Neck movements are adequate and thyromental distance is more than 6.5 centimeters. Systemic examination, inspection, no evidence of glossitis, angular stomatitis, or angular cheilitis. Shape of the abdomen is symmetrically enlarged with fullness of the flanks and globular distension. Umbilicus is normal in position, flattened with no discharge. Skin striae are noted. Skin over the abdomen is smooth and glossy with no scratch marks. Distance from the xiphisternum to the umbilicus is more than the distance from umbilicus to pubic symphysis. Abdomen moves normally with respiration. Dilated veins are visible in the left hypochondriac region. No visible pulsations noted. Spider nevi present. No hernial swelling or scars observed. No asterixis. No evidence of the depretrans contracture. No evidence of muscle wasting. History or loss of axillary hair is present and no palmar erythema. On palpation, abdominal girth measures 97 centimeters. Venous filling is seen away from the umbilicus. Superficial palpation has no guarding rigidity, tenderness in any quadrant. Deep palpation, the liver is palpable at 3-finger breadth below the right costal margin, firm and moves with respiration. No other organomegaly and no evidence of testicular atrophy. Percussion, upper border of the liver dullness is seen in the 5th intercostal space in mid-clavicular line, 7th intercostal space in the anterior axillary line. Shifting dullness is present, no organomegaly and no splenomegaly. Vowel sounds are present and normal, no bruit or no venous harm. Respiratory system, inspection, chest appears to be bilaterally symmetrical, trachea appears to be in the center, bilateral breast tissue appears enlarged, no abdominal respiratory movements, no use of axillary muscles of respiration, no visible veins, scar marks, breast tissue appears enlarged and spine appears normal. Palpation, gynecomastia is present, trachea is present in the center. Percussion, resonant note is heard over all lung fields. Auscultation, air entry is bilaterally clear, no crepitations or rhombi. Cardiovascular system, S1, S2 is normal, no murmurs, no abnormal pulsation, heat or thrill felt. Apical impulse is felt at the left 5th intercostal space, 1.5 centimeters medial to the mid-clavicular line. Central nervous system, higher mental functions are normal with no neurological deficit. Sensory and motor function is normal. Cranial nerve examinations is normal. Tone power reflex is normal. No obvious deformity noted in the spine. My clinical diagnosis will be 54-year-old chronic alcoholic with signs of hepatocellular failure in the form of jaundice, ascites, melena due to alcoholic liver disease with decompensated cirrhosis with signs of portal hypertension, posted for upper GI scopy.
So where is this patient fitting into which stage of cirrhosis?
This patient is having decompensated stage of cirrhosis now because he has features of portal hypertension as well.
Okay. Prerna, can you ask some questions?
Yeah, yeah. How do you decide what factors made you say that it is decompensated? Some classification or anything like that?
So the patient could be either in cirrhosis as compensated or decompensated. In decompensated cirrhosis, patient will be having features of portal hypertension and he will be in end-stage liver disease. The features of portal hypertension which can be seen will be the here, which in my case, ascites is prominent in this patient, which can be seen. Other than that, patient can have features of hepatorenal syndrome, hepatopulmonary syndrome, hepatic encephalopathy could also be there, and ascites, which is seen in this patient, and other various systemic involvement can be there.
So, hepatopulmonary syndrome, do you think this patient has or not, does not have, or what would you like to do to tell whether it is
Actually,
there or
this
not
patient,
there?
if the patient has hepatopulmonary syndrome, the major complaints which the patient would have been presenting would be dyspnea. And this dyspnea would have been increasing in sitting up position in comparison to lying down. Also, there would be a decrease in the basal oxygen saturation of the patient. Both of these things in clinical examination were not seen in this patient. So I don't think so that the patient might be having hepatopulmonary syndrome. But however, for further confirmation, we can do investigations like ABG evaluation to completely rule this out.
What is discomfort? You said patient was having with minimal effort, fatigue or something like that, right? When you
Yes,
presented
ma'am.
history.
Yes,
Yeah.
ma'am.
So can you? How do you classify this? Means breathlessness or whatever. Any classification you know?
Breathlessness, which I have employed here is for cardiac scale of breathlessness, is NYHA classification. So it's because the patient is elderly also. So NYHA classification, the patient is having here, in my case, breathlessness on moving up a slight slope. So that is coming under NYHA classification 2. He does not have a breathlessness at rest or doing more than ordinary activity, which would be then 3 or 4.
And any other investigation you said you would like to do for this thing? What is the common thing would be done for hepatopulmonary? For hepatopulmonary.
For
You said
hepatopulmonary,
you would like to do something which is commonly possible. What investigation?
uh, for this
Have
patient, ABG
yeah,
investigation can be done.
yeah. So what would ABG show?
ABG, if the patient is having hepatopulmonary syndrome, the normal saturation of the patient would be starting to decline. So minimally, it will be less than 80 mmHg, we can classify it. But again, there will be severity in this from mild, moderate, severe, or very severe. So if it is between, again, we can further classify it as if it's 60 to 80, it can be, so if it is less than 50, it is a very severe patient who might require liver transplantation. If it is 50 to 60, mild, moderate from 60 to 80. Yes.
Okay, Devangi, you can ask.
Devangi, can you ask some questions? Since Devangi is not heard, let me ask Nandita. Now, this patient is posted for GI endoscopy. So, what investigations would you like to see for?
So in this patient, because the patient is having history of melena, so general investigations which I would like to proceed with is one is a CBC, which shows hemoglobin, platelet count, as well as a WBC count of this patient. Second is I would also like to take this patient's LFT values, which contain bilirubin, AST, ALT, and
Dr. Nandita, please
JG.
justify each and every investigation which you are asking, okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Why
So
you are
first,
asking those investigations, please justify.
yes, ma'am. To begin with, CBC count hemoglobin to know the baseline hemoglobin. If it is there's a high chance that the patient is in anemia, so a blood transfusion would be required pre-op to stabilize the patient. I would like to do WBC count to see if the patient is having any leukocytosis, because of ascites, he could be in spontaneous bacterial peritonitis or such infected condition. So leukocytosis to rule out, I would like to do WBC count. Platelet
Is
count,
it possible that they can have a leukopenia?
leukopenia is also possible in this patient because these patients also have splenomegaly associated with portal
Very good.
hypertension.
Very
This
good.
can give sequestration resulting in leukopenia. Thirdly, I would like to do platelet count, and there's a high chance that the platelet count is reduced in this patient as a result of portal hypertension, splenomegaly, and splenic sequestration of the platelets. Second is I would like to do an RBS, that is fasting blood sugar and postprandial blood sugar if possible, because there is a high chance of endocrine derangements in this patient resulting in diabetes mellitus. So I would like to rule that out. Then thirdly, I would like to do a renal function test of this patient because as the patient is in decompensated portal hypertension, there is a high chance that the RFT may be deranged, especially serum creatinine and blood urea nitrogen. Next, I would like to do liver function test for this patient. To begin with, as the patient has jaundice, I want to see how much of the bilirubin would be affected in this patient. So serum bilirubin I would like to do. Then AST and ALT to gauge the amount of hepatocellular damage that has taken place. Then albumin function because liver is producing albumin and it is synthetic function of the liver. So I would like to see the albumin count of this patient. And for coagulopathy, I would like to assess the PT-INR of the patient. In addition to this, I would also like to see if the patient, because the ascites would have led to pleural effusion and that could cause problems intraoperatively. So I'd like to do a chest X-ray of this patient as well. And if eventually the condition would lead to hypokalemia because of the massive fluid shifts that could take place, as well as if it is heart is involved in this patient, like so there could be certain ECG changes that is seen. So I would like to do an ECG, and keeping in view of his age as well, I would like to do ECG for this patient.
Suppose this patient tells you that he is having an altered sleep pattern, he is having more of daytime somnolence and nighttime awakening is there. Okay, would you like to investigate further? Any particular investigation will you ask for?
The symptoms of daytime somnolence and the reversal in sleep pattern mainly indicate towards hepatic encephalopathy. So I would like to do blood ammonia level in this patient.
Very good. Devangi, would you like to ask now? Devangi is not audible.
Devangi.
Okay, Nandita, now this particular patient is posted for GI endoscopy. Hemoglobin is 9 gram%. Leukocyte count is normal. Platelet counts are normal. And the bilirubin is 3 milligram%. And serum albumin is 3 gram%. PT-INR is 1.9. The patient is complaining of no altered sleep pattern and ascites you have already examined. So where do you think this patient is fitting into? Can we stratify the risk if I have to explain the risk to the patients and patients' relatives?
Yes, ma'am. So this patient can be, first we need to assess the child puke score and the MELD sodium score for this patient in order to stratify the risk. So based on the investigations that you have given me, patient is coming under class B of the child puke score.
What is the total score coming here?
Total is 9, ma'am.
9. So
Yes,
what
ma'am.
is the likelihood of mortality for this GI endoscopy?
So as the patient is coming under 9 score, that falls under child Q class B, ma'am. So as if you consider this, the mortality rate should be around 30% for the patient.
Okay.
What procedure patient? Sorry. Just what endoscopy? What procedure patient is set for? Anything is clarified?
Endoscopy to evaluate if there is presence of varices. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Okay. Madam can continue.
Yeah.
I'm not able to. Yes, ma'am.
So when this patient is posted for say GI endoscopy and the initial GI endoscopy shows that there is a varices and patient is posted for the variceal ligation, okay, then how do you proceed for this particular patient? What are the main anesthetic considerations when the patient with this decompensated alcoholic liver cirrhosis is coming for the variceal ligation?
Because the patient is coming for variceal ligation, one thing that we have to keep in mind is there is a high chance of bleeding that can occur in the patient. And anesthetic drugs in itself can cause hemodynamic variations or alterations in this patient because of the presence of portal hypertension, which in itself will result in a hyperdynamic circulation. So that aspect has to be kept in mind while beginning to induce this patient for variceal ligation. So varicose ligation has a high chance of bleeding. There has to be backup for whatever bleeding happens by blood grouping and cross matching, and blood has to be kept in hand for this patient. Second is excessive bleeding can be controlled by pharmacological measures. So pharmacological measures have also to be kept in mind before taking the patient inside, especially drugs like vasopressin or octreotide can be given, which will cause splanchnic vasoconstriction in this patient. Thirdly is there are certain equipments which have to be kept ready so that in case if sudden unexpected bleeding occurs, for example, like the Sengstaken Blakemore tube can be used for this patient. So these equipments have to be kept ready before taking the patient for a varicose bleeding. And bleeding itself can cause further bilirubin releases, and it will also result in ammonia release, which will again aggravate encephalopathy if the patient is in encephalopathy. So neurological examination has to be done prior to taking this patient inside.
So how do you manage this case now for GI endoscopy? Varicose ligation.
For varicose ligation, the patient can be administered general anesthesia. And first is I would like to confirm the NGN status of this patient. Then as the patient is on diuretics, I would like to see the serum electrolyte values of this patient. Blood group and cross matching has to be kept ready. Once this is ready, I would take the patient inside, then attach the standard monitors. As the patient is having ascites, I would like to give a RAM position for this patient. Start the patient on IV fluid. I would like to choose plasma light over here. And once the standard monitors and the fluid is started, I would like to induce the patient. So induction agent which I would like to give here would be pre-medications in the form of injection glycopyrrolate 0.004 mg per kg. I would also like to give injection fentanyl for certain pain relief. About 1 to 2 micrograms can be given per kg. And then I would like to give, because the patient has ascites, there is high chance of having regurgitation, and therefore I would also like to give metoclopramide 0.2 mg per kg. Then I would like to proceed by giving rapid sequence induction for this patient, and therefore an assistant I would like to keep ready for giving rapid sequence induction. Then adequate deoxygenation will be given to this patient. Because of the ascites, it can cause a decrease in the FRC. So the apnea time will have a problem in this patient. Therefore, I would like to give adequate deoxygenation. Once that is done, I would like to induce the patient by giving, here I would like to choose injection etomidate 0.2 mg per kg in graded doses while watching for the hemodynamics. At the same time, the assistant will be giving required pressure for rapid sequence induction. Once this is done, I would like to give a relaxant in the form of injection succinylcholine 1.5 mg per kg. And after the pictures have gone, then I would like to insert the endotracheal tube number 7.5 and proceed with the case and give a maintenance dose. Here a large amount of, the slightly higher maintenance dose, and the induction, the maintenance agent which I would like to choose is atracurium, 0.75 mg per kg.
Can you do this case without intubation? I mean, for this endoscopy, what is your choice or whatever your institute? I have no this thing about it. But are all cases done with intubation, or there is other alternatives?
It can be done under sedation as well, ma'am. But there is a high chance of bleeding or rupture that can occur of the varices. So during that time, if we need to insert, if you want to do a secondary measure like insertion of a SB, Sengstaken Blakemore tube, or it is preferable to give general anesthesia.
Sengstaken Blakemore tube. Usually, such things are inserted in a when there is hematemesis occurring in a patient comes in, say, casualty or something like that. Yes, the patient is posted with no history of hematemesis or anything, right? This patient does not have. So very unlikely that the patient will need Sengstaken Blakemore tube.
Yes, yes.
No history of any. So probably it is just checking for varices, and if there is found any varices are found, then it would be there. So maybe you could do it under TIVA. Let's say it's possible to do under TIVA. So would you like to say how would you like to do it?
So if the patient is,
or you are, or if you are, you want to do it in with intubation only.
We could do it under TIVA as well, ma'am. So for TIVA, the agents that I would I would prefer would be, first I would take the patient inside, attach the standard monitors, keep the blood as a standby, and then give RAM position to the patient so that, because the respiration should not be hampered in this case. Then simultaneously, I would like to switch on O2 along with sevoflurane combination can be given, and intermittent doses of propofol with ketamine can be given for this patient.
Okay.
When
And,
you are talking about TIVA, would you give sevoflurane? What would be the disadvantage of giving inhalational agents over here?
Inhalation agents, the disadvantage with them is they cause a massive reduction in hepatic blood flow. So that would be a disadvantage for this patient because he's already having a compromised hepatic blood flow. So pure IV continuation with the IV dosages only would be good.
so how, and if at all, say let's say liver is not, how will you give sevoflurane? Because they're going to pass the scope through the mouth, right? So how are you planning to give sevoflurane without intubating?
So as to we have to see that the about
Now how will you give? Means by nasal cannula you mean?
no, by holding the mask on the patient.
That's what I'm saying. They will be introducing the scope, right? Endoscope will be through the mouth. So
Yes.
there is no, I mean,
Have you
mask
seen any
holding will not be
endoscopy
possible.
mask?
Yes, yes.
Nandita, have you seen endoscopy mask?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Bite block is applied, and then they introduce the endoscopy
No,
tube,
no.
ma'am.
That madam is asking you there is specific endoscopy mask which may not be available. Or, so which
No.
one is that?
No.
There are endoscopy masks which are there very much in our endoscopy suits. But in this particular case, especially if it is a bleeding varices, do you think it would be safer to do inhalational induction?
Uh,
Anyways, see, whatever choice you are giving, you have to justify in that particular situation.
yes, ma'am.
What other precautions will you be taking? Suppose you have decided and you have given a general endotracheal anesthesia. Any
Yes, ma'am.
other particular precautions to be taken during this particular case?
Precautions is one is I will be watching out for if there is intraoperative bleeding that is taking place in this patient. Then also watch for the drug dosages and the hemodynamics of the patient.
Yeah. So what will you watch for? How will you come to know that bleeding is occurring or not occurring during the endoscopy procedure? What will be your observation? Where all you will look for?
So first is if there is a sudden, if there is a tachycardia that is occurring in the patient along with a hypotension.
So that is our anesthesia monitor, right? Multipara
Yes.
monitor. Anything else you can look for where you in this endoscopy case, which will be more easier.
The monitor itself of the endoscopy, that itself will show us.
Yeah.
if
So
there
you
is
have to be very vigilant about it, right? You have to
Yes,
see
yes.
what the endoscopist is trying to do, because we'll come to know, because they sometimes inflate lot of air, so you have to be a little careful about that also. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
Any particular precautions will you be taking while extubating this patient?
While extubation, one is the patient has to be completely out of the effect of relaxant, because we this during the procedure it can if the patient's urological status is compromised, then we need to see the meditation is all right. So once the patient is completely out of the effect of anesthesia, only then I would like to extubate this patient.
There's always chances of bleeding, correct? So obviously it is better that the patient is completely awake with full gag reflex, preferable to even monitor the neuromuscular blockade and see that the patient is having complete return of all the activities. Okay. Now suppose the same patient has developed right inguinal hernia, and one of the day goes with the pain in abdomen to the surgeon, and surgeon decides to do the surgery because patient he's having a doubt that the patient has got obstructed inguinal hernia in this particular patient. So
Yes,
how do you go about managing this particular patient who's coming for an emergency surgery for obstructed inguinal hernia?
So because this patient is obstructed inguinal hernia and this patient's child peak score is coming under class B, so I would again, for this patient, it would be, there would be a high risk if I go with general, central neuraxial blockade. So for this patient also, it would be preferable to give general anesthesia. The investigations pre-op would be, similarly, I would like to see.
That we have done already. I told you
Yes.
the investigation values, you are aware about it. Okay. So how do you go about, what are the main, your concerns in this particular patient? And what are your main goals of anesthesia and how are you going to execute that particular plan?
So for this patient also, the goal is to prevent the patient, because I'm proceeding with a general anesthesia, I would prevent any massive decrease in the blood pressure which is occurring as a result of the anesthetic.
What are your main concerns in this particular patient? Compared to any other patient without comorbidity coming for an obstructed inguinal hernia, and compare it with the cirrhotic patient who's in a decompensated stage and who's coming for obstructed inguinal hernia. So what are your main concerns over here?
Because the patient is already in a decompensated state, his systemic involvement will be there. So depending upon whatever, because here the patient will be having ascites. So if the ascites is not tapped preoperatively, intraoperatively there could be when there could be massive fluid shifts that take place, resulting in a decrease in the blood pressure in this patient. So that is one concern because it's an abdominal surgery.
Okay.
Then the after that the
See, he's a cirrhotic patient. So already in a hepatic insufficiency, he's having a jaundice. Okay. He's already having ascites, portal hypertension is there. He's having anemia. His INR is altered. So he's having already coagulopathy.
yes, ma'am.
He is not showing at present any signs of renal failure, but he is having a possibility. Okay.
Yes.
He is not showing any signs of respiratory hepatopulmonary syndrome or portopulmonary hypertension right now. But those are the other concerns. Okay. So now what is your plan of anesthesia? What are your main goals in this particular patient?
Main goals will be so as to titrate the anesthesia as to prevent these complications from occurring. So that will be while induction of anesthesia, I would like to give a good pre-oxygenation to the patient, so as to cause prevention of the ascites-induced decrease in the FRC. Then the drugs, I want to see that the urine output is maintained during the surgery, so that the chance of patient going to hepatorenal syndrome are not there. While extubation of the patient, I want to see that the adequate mentation is maintained by the patient, so that the chance of patient going to hepatic encephalopathy is not there. And intraoperatively also, I would like to send an ABG so as to see the oxygen saturation of this patient or the PaO2 of the patient.
See, here the main goal of yours should be to maintain the normal coagulation, first of all, because there is an abnormality in the coagulation. Prior to surgery, you need to treat that coagulopathy. Secondly, intraoperatively, you need to maintain proper hepatic arterial blood flow. How you are going to maintain that, you are going to tell me. Then you need to see to it that you are giving all short-acting anesthetic agents, because all anesthetic pharmacology, pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics is affected. Okay. And then you have to see to it that there is no further worsening. Your agent should be such that they are not going to precipitate hepatic encephalopathy or hepatorenal shutdown. Okay. So what sequence you will go to prevent all these complications and to treat whatever complications have already occurred?
So first is to
INR, I said it is 1.9. So will you take up with 1.9 patient for surgery?
If it's 1.9 preoperatively, I would like to give the patient FFPs so as to normalize the INR, and then I would like to take the patient. Similarly, if the patient has if the patient is having alteration.
So will you give only FFP or simultaneously you will give vitamin K also?
vitamin K is also given 10 mg, can be given IV along
Yes.
with
It
How
will
much
take
vitamin
time,
K?
but you will have to give the vitamin K, and you will give even fresh frozen plasma. Dr. Prerna was asking something. Answer
No,
her.
I was so if vitamin K is to be given and you have time, okay, this is for hernia emergency. What is usually done? Let's say your previous when you're describing for endoscopy, vitamin INR values madam had already told, and you had time. So what would be advised, or what would the endoscopy unit do prior? Vitamin K, how many days usually is given?
3 days it is given 10 mg IV.
Yeah, okay. So if you have time, you can do that. In this particular where madam is asking about hernia, we don't have time because it's an obstruction. Yeah, okay, go ahead.
So the coagulopathy, then because the HB is 9, there is increased chance of massive fluid shifts in this patient. So I would like to keep blood ready for this patient. And the platelet count was normal in this patient. After that, intraoperatively, the positioning of the patient has to be kept in mind. Then, while inducing the anesthesia agents that are used, so hepatic blood flow has to be, because the major supply now for the liver will be through the hepatic artery, and the patient is already in a hyperdynamic state with a low systemic vascular resistance. So whatever drugs that is given, especially the induction agents, I would like to choose etoposide because it does not cause significant disruption in the hemodynamics in case of hepatic patient, and the pain relief that is given in this patient. So for that, I would like to choose fentanyl, which I would like to give in a lower dose than normal, maybe 1 to 1.5 micrograms in graded doses once again. And I would avoid giving morphine in this patient because morphine is metabolized in the liver. Then for the muscle relaxant, which I would like to choose for this patient also, I would take care to avoid the drugs which are metabolized in the liver or in the kidney. So I would like to choose 6-etracurium or etracurium, which undergoes elimination by Hoffman's elimination. And the inhalational agent also, which I would like to choose, would be sevoflurane. And I would do urine output monitoring regularly as well. And if intra-op the patient starts developing if the vasopressor is needed, so higher dose of vasopressors can be administered to this patient. Also, post-operatively, if I would like to give analgesia or intra-op also, I would like to avoid NSAIDs in this patient because it may cause a renal compromise once again. And I would like to go for administration of blocks post-operatively for post-op pain relief.
When during the surgery or after you have intubated the patient, when do you expect hemodynamic changes to occur? Critical time during the procedure, tell me when hemodynamic fluctuations can occur.
One important thing is because one is during the induction itself, it is a critical time. Then during the surgery, there is it's an abdominal surgery and the abdomen contains ascitic fluid or peritonic fluid is there. So when the drainage of the fluid takes place, then also there will be a problem. These are the two critical time, and intraoperatively.
So incision you have to be very careful, and when they're opening the peritoneum, to be very vigilant with the suction noise, continuous flow with the suction, and you see that you give adequate fluids or whatever if needed supports, vasopressors or whatever. Okay, any other specific things you would like to continue? I mean, you are continuing with something else. Your management.
Intraoperatively, I would like to avoid NSAIDs, and I would also not like to give paracetamol also in this patient because acetaminophen is again metabolized in the liver, so that would prolong its duration of action. And I would like to stick on to fentanyl in this case for analgesia. And post-operatively, I would post-operative before extubation. Once the patient is completely awake, only then I would like to extubate. And post-operatively also, I would like to give block as analgesic measure for this patient.
Any other special precautions in the post-operative period? Any other special precautions you will be taking in the post-operative period? How long you will keep in the post-operative recovery room or ICU? What are your main concerns in the post-operative period in this particular patient?
Post-operative is abdominal, because it's an abdominal surgery, there should be no disturbance in the respiration of the patient. So to make sure that the patient is adequately breathing and the arterial blood gases should have a the patient should have a good ABG report. And apart from that, the worsening of coagulopathy should not occur as a result of stress of surgery. And adequate fluid management, and if there is recurrence of ascites, the treatment of the same.
Suppose this patient post-operatively there in the recovery room, the next day investigations are sent. The pre-operative creatinine was 1.3 milligram percent. Now the creatinine has become 2.6 milligram percent. What is your take on it?
So because this patient is decompensated portal hypertension, I would like to think about the patient undergoing hepatorenal syndrome, especially hepatorenal syndrome, which is of type 1 variant, because there is a massive increase in creatinine for this patient. And I would like to monitor the urine output as well of the patient and see the GFR.
So how would you, I mean, when do you say that this patient is developing the hepatorenal syndrome? Just because the creatinine has come 2.6, you will label him as a hepatorenal syndrome, or would you
No.
like to see specifically something?
So for labeling the patient as hepatorenal syndrome, I would like to see that the cause is only because of the liver condition and not due to anything else. So I'd like to eliminate all the other causes first and then draw a conclusion that the patient is having because of the hepatorenal syndrome. For that, the GFR of this patient will be less than I would like to measure the GFR. If it is less than 40 ml per minute, then with the absence of other causes like septicemia, presence of nephrotoxic drugs, if there is no other GI or renal losses occurring in this patient, or if there is no UST suggestive of obstructive uropathy, and also if the patient's 24-hour urine output is less than 1.5 liter per day, along with a decrease in the urinary sodium, then I would probably think that the patient may be having hepatorenal syndrome.
Yeah, you need to keep them for a longer time in the recovery room or in a post-op ICU, because you need to check their fluid electrolyte status. You need to check the glucose status because glucose reserve is going to be less. You need to keep a check on their sensorium because chances of hepatic encephalopathy are going to be higher. Hepatorenal syndrome you have to watch for because they can go into hepatorenal shutdown. Now, can any preventive measures be taken to prevent this patients going into hepatic encephalopathy?
For prevention, one is hepatic encephalopathy, so that we have to see that the amount of any cause that causes increase in ammonia level, like if there's inadvertent GI bleeding in this patient, or certain other factors such as drugs or anything that will precipitate the patient from causing increased ammonia content, that has to be prevented because that is the primary cause which may lead the patient to undergo hepatic encephalopathy. So the drugs, presence of GI bleeding, if the patient is having good bowel movement or not constipation, all these things have to be avoided so as to prevent the patient from undergoing hepatic encephalopathy.
Prerna and Devangi, any more questions? Because time is running. Time is almost up.
Yeah, that's why actually. Otherwise, maybe if you are like little less, you can ask for this patient, let's say, has undergone this surgery and still the patient is deteriorating after 6 months, 8 months. Patient may be posted for liver transplant. I just want to tell me the stages of liver transplant. Just enumerate.
Yes, liver transplantation can be done in 3 stages. So basically, there is a pre-anhepatic stage, anhepatic stage, and the neo-hepatic stage. So in the pre-anhepatic stage, what they do is they will dissect the liver from its surrounding structures. So in this stage, there's a high chance that there will be fluid shifts that occur. So we have to be vigilant on that by keeping vasopressors ready and adequate amount of fluid or the blood products ready in this stage. Second stage is the patient will be having the anhepatic stage. So anhepatic stage, so the liver is removed and the donor liver is put in the recipient's body. So in this stage, they will do clamping of the vena cava is done in this stage. So they could be doing it in 2 processes. Either they could do an en bloc clamping in which there is a venous bypass, which is veno-venous bypass, which is required, or else they could be doing it by partially clamping the that's called a piggyback technique, by partially clamping the IVC. So in this stage, it is a stage in which there is complete cut down of the blood flow. So we have to make sure that the good cardiac output is maintained to the patient at this stage, as well as in this stage, the reperfusion also occurs of the graft. So electrolyte imbalances, if they are there, or ABG abnormalities, they have to be corrected in this stage. Adequate amount of, we have to prevent that excessive amount of fluid should not be given in this stage, because that may also cause pulmonary hypertension, increase CVP, and decreased perfusion of the graft because of this. So that is the concerns. And also we have to give at this stage, the immunosuppressant drugs have to be given, and drugs which are metabolized to the liver have to be avoided, because this in this stage the donor liver will be put into the recipient's body. Third stage will be the neohepatic stage. So neohepatic stage, our main concern will be if there is presence of bleeding which occurs as a result of clot lysis syndrome. So clot lysis syndrome is a DIC-like picture which can be seen in the patient. So in that time, we have to keep antifibrinolytic drugs ready, and blood products can also be kept ready in this stage. And and investigations can also be done throughout the procedure, such as thromboelastograph, which tells us exactly where the fault is, and accordingly it can be given, the whatever product is supposed to be given.
Okay, the perfusion will not start in the second phase. Okay, the liver perfusion will be after they release the clamps. So that will be in the third, when hepatic phase. So that is not in the second phase. And just tell me one last question. One test you would like to do to know whether liver has started functioning. You can do it when the clamping is done, and you would like to do it after things are settled, after the new hepatic phase has started. One blood investigation, blood, or you can have you do have one on the spot test nowadays available. Cartridges are available. Liver functioning, anything, because there is a lot of time where there could be acidosis and things like that.
ADG.
So ABG is done routinely, TAG is done routinely. They will be done at regular intervals. The blood lactate levels you can do. Blood lactate levels. Okay, so that is one good indicator of what was the first phase as well. In first phase, your very most important thing what is the bleeding which occurs. So if your patient selection is with very high varices, big varices and all, then you expect massive blood loss. So depending on the tag, you will decide your blood products.
By the way, which kind of fluid will be preferred in this particular case with liver failure?
In this patient, I would like to use balanced salt solutions which are free from lactate. So I would like to use Plasma-Lite in this patient.
Okay, very good. Devangi, any last question? You're not heard, Devangi. Since we can't hear our fourth examiner, Dr. Devangi Parikh, I would like to conclude this particular exam. Very nice attempt done by Dr. Nandita over here. And one more thing you have to remember is these patients can come for tips. Okay, nowadays a lot of interventional radiology things are going on. So any particular one precaution for the tips?
Tips will again precipitate the patient to hepatic encephalopathy. And second important thing is, once the tips is placed, there is massive increase in venous return that happens. So both these things have to be kept in mind, importantly, for tips, so that the patients.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Nandita.
Yes.
Dr. Prerna and Dr. Devangi, we conclude this particular session over here.
Yeah,
and thanks to KEM Organizing Secretary for giving us this opportunity to take the mock exam. And thanks for giving our candidate a chance to appear for this particular mock exam. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, good case presentation, Nandita.
Thank you.